First things first for a game of Nova Aetas is setup. Each scenario is going to have a nice picture of a map with the buildings, tokens, starting enemy locations, any trees or bushes lined out pretty well, and then also starting position of heroes. You have any special rules for that scenario over here, starting position of action tokens on the clock here, also the start time for the clock and the end time for the scenario. And then also your victory rewards and your defeat rewards. Next is going to be set up for the heroes. Just for the example here, I'm just going to use the Squire class. You start with the green class, and that is your class symbol. You will also have 3 starting equipment per class, which you can find by the green sword symbol in the case of the Squire. For the other classes, it'll be a different symbol, but same color. The reason there are other colors on some of these cards is that when you get a class later and level up, you can still use this equipment if you wish. Lastly, you also get a threat dial, which will be set to 1 at the start of every scenario. Before we go into the game proper, let's explain the clock. So the clock is sort of the main driver of Nova Aetas. Basically the way it works is this minute hand, whenever it hits a sector, and there's like sort of triangle shapes, where there's at least 1 token, that sector becomes active, and characters and enemies there get to perform their action. So in this example, we have the Squire by himself over here, and he is now active because the minute hand is on his sector. So for the sake of example, he's going to spend 2 action points, 1, 2, to perform 2 movement, which we'll explain movement later, but that's basically the way it works. So you spend your action points and you move along the clock. The Squire gets to end his turn here because he spent more action points than the enemy. He could have, if he wished, spent 1 and then activated again when the minute hand came here. If in this case the Squire actually did end his turn there, and let's say the minute hand moves up and now activates this sector, well, this enemy, this particular enemy, actually has 5 action points, and so does the Squire. So actually the enemy would activate first in this case. If the enemy had only 4 action points, the hero would go first. We're going to go back to this configuration, and basically since now the minute hand is here, the enemy would be active. Enemies have to spend all of their action points. So in this case, this enemy has 5. We could say he does an attack, which is 3 action points. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then an additional to be just beyond the camera there. Once again, the minute hand would move up, and now it would be the Squire's turn again. So one more example here. I'm just going to show this. This is probably an extremely rare, if not impossible scenario, but it may happen. So in this case, the hero, even if they spent all 5 of their action points, would still be 1 sector short of the enemy. And that's actually totally fine because at least he spent all his action points. So he would, in that case, get an additional activation when the minute hand comes around. There is a bonus rule here. Normally the way you play is that you spend your action points and then you move the token. So let's just say the Squire there spent all his activation, he would end there, and that just happens right away. The other way to play is to actually spend your action points as you use them. So let's say he does 1 movement, then because he's entered this space, you would actually check if there's any enemies of this type that are in the same control area as the Squire. If they are, then they would activate based on their AI. Don't worry about understanding area control at this point. I do go over that later in the video. But this is just kind of a bonus rule. You do not have to play that way at all, but if you want to, in a more advanced sort of setting, go for it. So let's look at a hero card and see how to actually read it so that we know what actions we can perform, etc. So first we'll start up here, D6. This basically for every test that the Squire rolls, he's going to be rolling D6s. Other classes roll D8s. And you'll notice the change up top here. This symbol right here and this number refer to action points. So the Squire has 5 action points. Next is physical. So this is the number of die you will roll when making a physical attack or some sort of physical test. This symbol here refers to mind, and the squire here will only roll 1 die for maybe casting a spell or determining whether he defends against a spell, some such. This symbol down here, lastly, is health. So the squire has 5 health to start with. So let's go over the actions that can be done per every hero's turn. The first most basic action that can be formed is a move action. For every square move, that is 1 action point. There is no diagonal movement, so this is not legal. You can only move horizontally or vertically. So if I were to use all 5 action points to move, I could go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 if I wished, or in some other sort of combination. That would be really illogical, but nonetheless, that's the kind of move you can make. Another action that heroes can perform is interacting or picking up objects. Each of those actions requires 1 action point and requires you to be adjacent to the object in question. Right here is a loot bag, so for 1 action point the hero can pick up that item. We have a lever which, according to some missions, will open doors or close them depending on the scenario. So for 1 action point, the hero can interact with it to do whatever the mission says that it does. Another action that heroes can perform is a jump. Jump is generally used to move from one building to another. Every hero has a base jump value of 2. The way that means is basically just like move, it costs 1 AP per square. So even though you're moving from just 1 space, you're really moving 2. So 2 action points to get from this roof to that roof. For 1 action point, the hero may climb. Most heroes require the use of a ladder, which you can see here, to go up 1 level. If the mission designated ladders to be placed to link rooftops, you can move across them. Just like regular movement rules, it's 1 action point per square, so in this case, it'd be just 2 action points to move to the other roof. Even this example would work, but it would require 3 action points to move from this roof to this roof. If an enemy is on the other side of the ladder, you cannot cross, and you can also not stop in the middle of a ladder. But by that ruling as well, in this case, the enemy could not move across the ladder either. Heroes may also activate skills during their turn. Some look like this. They will be passive because they have no action point cost at the bottom. Exception, this skill has an action point cost of 2. Always down here there will be a cost of the skill. Another action that heroes can perform is disengage. But to understand disengage, you really have to understand what engage is. So the reason I divide this up is largely because player characters can't really use the engage action. I suppose you could spend the 1 action point it does cost to do an engage action and lock that enemy to its space, but as soon as the enemy activates, they could just move away for free. They don't have to roll when doing a disengage test, which I will go over shortly. But let's understand what engage exactly is. Engage is basically a grab or a hold you could think of that enemies perform to keep heroes locked to their space. The way it works, we're going to have our enemy start over here. He starts with 5 action points. Now let's say this hero has aggro, and so he's going to go 1, 2, 3. So he's got 2 action points left. Now he doesn't have enough to attack, so he's going to spend 1 action point to engage this hero. The hero is now locked to that space. He can't just move away for free. You would have to perform a disengage test, which I will go over shortly. There are several ways that engage can be activated. It really just requires base-to-base contact, but that's not the only thing. So, for instance, if the hero comes in, moves in, base-to-base contact, and attacks, these 2 are now engaged. Same if the enemy were to move in and had enough action points to actually attack. They would also engage. This does mean that heroes can actually move past enemies and not become automatically engaged with them, as long as they don't attack. Engage can become a little tricky when you have multiple enemies on the board. Sometimes it's hard to tell who's engaged with who perhaps there's a hero here, and maybe in this case, she doesn't actually have the highest threat value, so he's not really engaged with her because he was moving towards him. So attempt to solve that sort of confusion, I came up with the idea of if they are engaged, I will have the enemy actually face the hero, and in this case, since this enemy is not engaged with her, I would turn them around so he's facing the other way. Now this might get confusing when you have two heroes really close to each other, and let's say this enemy up here isn't engaged with either one of them. Now in that case, just, as best as possible, face them away. The game has no actual way of tracking this. Disengage is an action that allows a hero to basically move away from an enemy. In this case, since these two are base-to-base contact, the hero can't just move away willy-nilly. He has to do a disengage test, because the presence of one enemy requires at least a 4 or higher, and then you can move away from the enemy. In the case a hero becomes engaged with 2 enemies, the disengage test raises by 1, and in this case would require a 5 or higher in order to move away. Same goes if a hero is suddenly engaged with 3 enemies, thus they need a 6 to be able to move away. There are a couple bonus rules for disengaging. If there are more heroes on the board than enemies, the hero trying to disengage with the enemy gets a +1 to their dice roll. So in this case, you would need a 3 or higher to actually be able to disengage. The last bonus rule, basically if the hero has a higher rapidity, or sort of their action point value, is higher than the enemy they're attempting to disengage, they do get 1 free reroll. Another action that can be performed is entering and exiting buildings. This can only be performed if the mission allows for that, and also if the door seen on the building is the actual door designated by the mission. So in this case, this hero could freely enter the building for 2 action points. Also, if they were inside, they could freely exit for 2 action points. If an enemy is in front of the door, such as this one, the squire would be unable to enter the building, even if they moved here or there. If an enemy is in front of the doorway and the squire is inside the building, they can still exit and actually enter one of this square or this square. If all 3 squares are blocked, though, the squire could not exit the building. Lastly, a hero can spend anywhere from 1 to their maximum value of action points to wait. So 1, 2 for instance, and just wait until the clock comes back around. For a melee combat example, we have the squire here using 3 action points to perform a melee attack against this enemy. On the card, the squire has a melee value of 4, thus he gets to roll 4 die. This enemy has a resistance of 5+ for melee, thus the squire performed 2 successes, and that's 2 hits to this enemy. If the squire had gotten an additional success, well, thus like that would be a critical. Criticals only work for physical attacks, and it's +1 extra damage. So in this case, the squire would have done 4. So let's be range combat example on the ground. So to do range combat, you need line of sight and also range. We're using the sorcerer's spell Arcane Bolt, which has a range of 6. Thus, in this case on this board, we're completely in range. So before I show a range example, let's learn how to trace line of sight. Line of sight in this game is basically one full side to one full side of the enemy. So the way to do this would be take the 2 corners from the hero. So in this case, I'm going to take this corner and this corner, and we're going to trace a line. So this corner is going to here, and then this corner goes to here. Thus, since nothing was blocking, the hero has clear line of sight. Trees and buildings are scenic elements that will block line of sight. Also, in this case, if the sorceress is trying to attack this enemy, she could not because this enemy is blocking her line of sight. Line of sight on top of buildings is a little bit more complicated, but not much. Melee combat from the top level to a bottom level will never happen. Also, from one building to another building, if there was another one over here, is not possible. In the case of this building, because the sorceress is directly in the center, she cannot trace line of sight to either of the enemies. But neither enemy can trace line of sight to her. If the sorceress was in this corner or anywhere along this side of the building, she would be able to see this enemy, but could not see this enemy. If she was on this side, or anywhere along this side, she could see this enemy, but not this enemy. Spells work quite like melee. The big difference here is this eye symbol. So for this spell to be successful, you need at least 2 successes. And also, it only does 2 wounds, regardless of how many successes you roll. For the apprentice here, she has a mind value of 4, and just like the squire is going to get to roll 4 die. The spell resistance value of this enemy is 4+. She rolled a 4 and a 5, thus the spell is a success, and she scores 2 wounds. Next we'll go over combat and how enemies work. So we'll just use this enemy as the example. Up here is their action point total. Crosshair symbol refers to their area of control, which affects whether they're active or not. Here we have physical resistance, then mental resistance, and then lastly health. Down here is their attack. This is basically how they work. So this symbol here is range. The next is damage. This is for the heroes. You need, when you roll for a resistance roll, you need a 5+ as to be a success. And then lastly, another effect that is applied on a hit. Lastly, if there's anything listed down here, you can check the back of the rulebook just to see exactly what they do, but largely this is going to be fluff text. In this case, light armor gives +1 hit points, but that's already incorporated into the card itself, so you don't actually have to worry about memorizing that. Here had 4 threat value, and the sorceress here had 5 threat value. Then the enemy is going to go for her. So he would move 1, 2, and since he has 5 action points, he has a further 3 to do his attack, which, if we look at the enemy card again down here, these attacks always hit as long as they perform the action points to do so. So he's going to do 2 damage. She can roll a resistance roll and see if she does 5+, and then if it's a hit, he also does bleeding. A resistance roll for each hero is going to be what it is. So since this is a physical attack, the sorceress here will roll her physical value, which in this case is only 1. And in this case she scored a 5, which means she does block 1 damage, but the other damage does go through and it's bleeding. If at any point a hero receives 5 wounds, basically their total health, you will lay the miniature on its side. On the clock, you move their activation token 6 sectors forward. The other heroes have 6 sectors to heal this character, to treat them basically. If they do not, then that hero will receive a wound card. This will affect them by making them slower, or perhaps they have to use more action points to move. Basically, it's a negative effect. In between each scenario though, you do have potentially the chance to heal it and then not have to worry about it.